All right, so today we're going to be talking about the ontological argument and basically the arguing for a soul. And then once you have the soul, you can make an argument from consciousness to the existence of God. So these are these arguments are very philosophical in nature. I am not a philosopher. I'm interested in philosophy, but sometimes this stuff gets way over my head. And particularly when we get to the argument for the soul, I start to get, it's a hard one. And I've only taught on it a few times, and a lot of times when you take an apologetics class, they'll skip these two lessons because they are, difficult in nature and kind of above the average person. Can you hold on to Pumpkin? I don't really want her. Thank you. All right, so let's start by, what did you guys watch? What did you learn?
I watched a good amount of the debate.
The debate?
Mm-hmm. Between William Lane Craig and Christopher Hitchens.
Wait, what are you talking about? This is week 8, the ontological argument.
Yeah.
Where is that debate?
Wait. Okay, I watched the debate between those two.
Okay.
Wait, what?
Okay, really, what I said is I recommend that you either read chapter 8 in the book, which I had it on here. If you wanted to, you could have read that, or you were supposed to listen to, and I had both the PDF and the audio of the book, the chapter on the ontological argument. And then, or it says, but if you have 2.5 hours, I strongly urge you to listen to the case for the existence of the soul, which would have been that one right there. And that's J.P. Moreland on the case for the existence of the soul. Did anybody do their homework? Yeah, okay. All right, what'd you
Chapter 8.
Okay. What were your thoughts?
It was good. It was hard for me to pay attention, but my favorite part was when he was talking. He kind of used the example of presidents, and he was saying, no one would argue that if you said some president with a number, that wouldn't be sensible in this world or in any other world. A person is not a number.
Okay.
But if you were to say some name is a president, that would make sense in our world. That hasn't happened in the U.S., but that could be somewhere else.
I don't remember that. Oh, you're right. There you are. Interesting. So is that to talk about possible worlds?
I think he was using that to explain that if somebody were to say if there could be a God, God exists just not in this world. He segued into how if God exists in any world, he would exist in every world.
Okay.
In our world.
All right.
So I was I don't really understand it.
Okay. Well, at least what? So okay. So, see, that's good because you're coming with an expectation of trying. You have now a question that you want to fill the void with,
right.
And so even just creating that void is good. Because that provides you some place to put the information. Whereas if you came to this class knowing really nothing, it would you wouldn't glean as much. So, did you? You did it. All right. Did your brain pop?
There's some weird thing in there that was Mormons think that every cell in your body is a cell, and when they all align to do the right thing,
Yeah. Yeah, I don't remember that part, but I haven't listened to it in a while. But
Oh, I do have a question.
yeah.
And I did do the book too.
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out what I watched.
This was a hard one, so it's hard to even explain what you listened to.
The greatest conceivable being.
Yeah, this is that one. Yeah.
It's the whole how if he's a god, then he has to be the god in all the other universes. Then a question popped in my mind. I have no idea what bearing it takes, but it's just okay, but does that necessarily have to be that God has to be good in all of them, or can he also have that if everything's possible, can he also be completely evil in one?
This argument only works for the greatest conceivable being. So a greatest conceivable being would have all the great making properties and no lesser making properties.
Okay.
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 So,
yeah, 'cause that was one of the
yeah.
questions. I was just like, but if everything's possible, is that yeah? Okay.
Okay.
So to me, I think the way I understand it, it's the greatest conceivable being, and there could be no greater conceivable being, because then that would be God.
Right. And so, okay. All right. So let me kind of give you a brief overview of today. Okay. First, we're going to talk about the ontological argument, which basically the way this argument works is it starts from the nature of what's being conceived and basically tries to say that you cannot reasonably conceive of a greatest conceivable being not existing. Because if you think you have, if you've conceived of a greatest conceivable being that didn't exist, you haven't really conceived fully of a greatest conceivable being. And that one kind of throws people for a loop because it feels like a trick. It feels like a trick, basically. And so it's often not used in debates, although it is one of the arguments that has more philosophers have talked about this one than any other. When you look at like the history of philosophy, really all the kind of, ever since Anselm, every major philosopher has touched on this one in some sense. Some have reformulated the argument, but it's taken seriously by serious thinkers. So don't just assume because it seems like a trick for you that you're just going to write it off. Put some thought into it, because a lot of great thinkers have put a lot of thought into it as well. And guys, like I said, as it goes with all of the stuff I cover, I mean, I'm giving arguments that these aren't like, I'm not giving you divinely inspired scripture. I'm giving man's philosophical arguments. So these arguments could be wrong. I just want to throw that out there. I could be wrong. I don't think I am. I wouldn't be covering it if I wasn't. Maybe I would, just for the sake of you knowing. I mean, even if you don't agree with the argument, it's worth knowing what the ontological argument is, because it's covered so much in philosophical history, and you'll as you read books, they'll talk about it, and it's worth knowing what it is. The other thing is the case for the soul. And basically what there's really, okay, so the case for the soul kind of has two steps. The first step is to show that brain events are not the same thing as mental events. They don't have the same properties. They're not, you cannot reasonably describe one. There are things that are true of one that are not true of the other, things that are true of the other that's not true of the one. That you
Give an example.
There's an aboutness to mental events, like a thought. A thought is about something. I could have a thought about my bird, right? But there's no aboutness. The physical properties do not have the property of aboutness. The physical, so, and then likewise, there are things true of physical properties such as spatial locality. I have a list of them. Publicly accessible, spatially located, does not undergo change for the sake of some end. The physical properties do not, when you describe mental events, they do not exist, they do not have that essence of physical property. So it's, so the first step is to show that mental events are not the same thing as brain events. The second step is to show that, so, okay, if there are truly non-physical mental properties, then you have something called dualism, where mind is separate from matter. Mind is independent of matter. If you believe they're the same thing, you're a physicalist. Mind and matter are the same. Mind is matter. And so once you've established dualism, there's two types of dualists. There's mere property dualists and there are substance dualists. So substance dualists would... So the question is, what has the mental properties? Is it the brain that has the mental properties, or is it another substance that has the mental properties? And so, when we talk about the case for the soul, the first thing we have to do is argue against physicalism. And then, once you're a dualist, there are rare atheists who are dualists, but they are extremely rare. Most atheists are physicalists. So right once your main guns should be aimed at physicalism, because that would really take down. There are some. I think the atheists I actually have a video posted on your website by an atheist who is a property dualist. This one, David Chalmers. They're rare. And I really don't quite understand where they're coming from. There's this whole thing with emergence, that these guys believe in, but they're the oddballs, and then there are Christians who are property dualists, and there are Christians who are substance dualists. But I think substance dualism is really the most biblical stance, the belief that there is this substance, this immaterial substance that is you, that the real you is not flesh and blood, it's not the brain, that there is a immaterial substance called the soul, and that is the thing that has consciousness. Okay, it's an immaterial thing. Okay, so again, with the case of the soul, you want to address that mind is not the same as matter, and then the question is, what has the property, what has mental properties? Is it the brain or is it the soul? And so that's where we're going. Okay, and then after that, you can make this argument that if there is the existence of, if there are genuinely true non-physical mental properties, then that leads to the argument, you make the case that you can't get something from nothing, and you can't get mind from matter. You have to start with mind in order to get mind. And that becomes an argument for theism. All right, so here we go. All right. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do for you guys. Because this one's so hard, I'm going to let this one be like your freebie. You can, if you didn't understand a video, or in the future you don't understand a video, it might be a good idea to do this one as a makeup. So you could do it optionally for extra credit. Yeah, so just throw that out there. You don't have to do this one because it's really hard, and if you don't get it and it's totally confusing, I don't want to make you stress over it because it is a stretch. But personally, I would want to do this one because it's actually one of my favorite arguments. And it's just on the ontological argument. I'm not even going to begin to make you do the one on the soul. So if you just do the ontological argument, make the case for the ontological argument. All right. So for your slides, if you were going to do them, briefly introduce the ontological argument, basically what it is and how it works. And basically, the ontological argument is an a priori argument. So what do we mean by a priori versus a posteriori? We've covered this. Think back to second lecture. A priori versus a posteriori. Perfect, yes. So before sense experience. So basically, when you think of an a priori argument, we're talking purely philosophical. There's it doesn't require knowledge of the external world. If you were a brain in a vat with if you were just a conscious entity with no awareness of sight, hearing, smelling, feeling, touching, tasting, Nothing. No knowledge of the external world, just yourself and your thoughts, and you're conscious. You could, a priori arguments are things, or knowledge that is known a priori could be known in such a state. So this is an example of an a priori argument. And so for that reason, it's the only a priori argument, truly a priori argument. It's, and it's interesting. It's very interesting. And again, basically, the way it works is the concept of God is not just our definition of God. See, this is where atheists get all hung up. It's like, well, you've defined God into existence. No, it's not the definition. It's what does the thought imply? We are thinking of a greatest conceivable being. And when you truly follow that through, it implies the existence of such a being. So that's basically how the argument works. St. Anselm is credited as the originator of the argument, and it's fascinated the minds of most philosophers for about 1,000 years. He, again, don't write this one off just because you find it confusing or it seems like a trick. It's been handled by serious thinkers for a long time. It's probably one of the oldest arguments for the existence of God. And it goes back over 1,000 years, I think. Over 1,000 years. The famous atheist Bertrand Russell, he's the guy who wrote Why I'm Not a Christian, famous atheist, one of the most famous of all times. He said, the ontological argument does not, to a modern mind, seem very convincing, but it is easier to feel convinced that it must be fallacious than it is to find out precisely where the fallacy lies. And I think that kind of captures what I'm trying to say here, is don't write it off. It's it's a really powerful argument if you understand it. And it's kind of funny. Last Thanksgiving, I was sitting downstairs in my uncle's giant house, three-story mansion in Las Vegas. We do our Thanksgivings there, and he comes down and he's like, I was at a conference and they were talking about the ontological argument. I just don't understand that one. You want to explain that to me? Because I just don't get it. And meanwhile, my brother's there. My brother, he doesn't really talk about God that much. Lately, he's kind of come around, but for a long time, he wouldn't talk about it, other than, to kind of jabbing questions, but mostly just, when it really got serious, he would just avoid the conversation. And, I explained it to him, and I had my computer, and it was connected to the Apple TV, so I'm showing videos and still not getting it. My cousin doesn't get it, and he's just they're just I don't get it. And meanwhile, I've explained it 4 or 5 times. I've showed four videos on the topic, and my brother's like, I get it. It actually makes a lot of sense. And he's like, just it's just weird. Some people get it, some people don't. It's a hard one. But it was interesting that of all people, my brother, with that, and he was impressed by it. He thought it was, really intriguing. And people will find this one intriguing because a lot of times it's you throw the same old stuff at people. They're used to the, well, how did the world get here? How can you explain life? Moral argument's pretty common. But this one's you want to throw a curveball, a real, genuine, curveball. This one, can sometimes really hit people in a way that other arguments won't. All right, so again, okay. Next part, if you were going to do your slides, to define ontology, modal logic, possible worlds, a priori argument, and necessary being and contingent being. So these are all just vocabulary words that I'm going to be using And so I need to define the vocabulary words before I start just talking and using these words, right? Okay, so ontology. Ontology is basically the study of being. So you could, it has to do with metaphysics, being, the nature of something. Okay, so if you were to study something's essence, you would be describing its ontology. You would be describing it ontologically. Okay, so just think being, or nature. That's what ontology has to do with. Now, modal logic is a type of logic that deals with the realms of what is possible and what is necessary. And we've talked a little bit about that. We talked a little about that when we talked about the cosmological argument. We got into this whole thing about, remember we got way off topic in the beginning and started talking about possible worlds and necessary being, and and I described necessary being as a being, well, hold on, I don't want to get ahead of myself. So there are, within the realm of things, there are things that are possible, there are things that are not possible, and there are things that are necessary, right? And so modal logic deals with that. And one formulation of the argument will be utilizing modal logic as the basis for the argument. So modal logic has to do with necessary and possibility. So possible worlds. So I'm going to be describing the argument. For example, there's a premise in Plantinga's version of the ontological argument that states that God exists in some possible world. And when I say possible world, simply what I'm meaning is a way of describing reality that's logically coherent. It involves a coherent concept. For example, if I could say unicorns exist in some possible world. Do unicorns exist? No. Okay, but there is a possible world in which unicorns exist, right? I could describe a world, a reality such that unicorns exist, right? So that, so philosophers use these possible world semantics to make arguments. Use it when it comes to modal logic. So married bachelors. Is there a possible world in which a married bachelor exists? Some said yes. No. And it's not just our arbitrary definition, it's what the concept implies, right? It's not just, we've decided that if we think of what is implied by a married man and what is implied by a bachelor, the two thoughts they could not be combined to be one in the same thing. There is no way of describing reality that would include a married bachelor. Does that make sense? There's no possible world. We can think of many, many possible worlds, but we can't think of any that would have married bachelors in them.
Meaning, how would you formulate that? Would be because it's not by definition not true, because we define the word bachelor to a...
It has to do with the concepts. The concepts are incompatible. You can't have the same thing.
I totally agree, but how would I word that?
That's what the thought of a married bachelor is incoherent. You cannot reasonably describe a person as being such that has the property of being married and he has the property of being a bachelor at the same time, in the same sense. And it has to do with the concept itself, just not. People, when you start talking like this, people get all caught up. Well, that's just how we define our words and all this stuff. The idea of call it whatever you want to call it. There's an idea associated with being married, and there's an idea associated with being a bachelor. Those two ideas are incompatible with each other. You can't be the same. You cannot be married and a bachelor at the same time, in the same sense. So, again, there is no possible world in which married bachelors exist. And then we had talked about this on the first lecture. There is no possible world in which the laws of logic or the law of non-contradiction do not exist. We talked about the law of non-contradiction, that its justification is the impossibility of the contrary. And so that's our basis for believing it. And really, all the laws of logic, they're known a priori. They are, they deal within the realm of certainty, what cannot possibly be. And so you cannot describe, there is no possible world in which the laws of logic do not exist. Okay, so possible worlds, we got that? Okay, next one, a priori argument. I already used this in my language. It's an argument that does not require sense experience. Could be known even if you had no knowledge of the external world. I've already talked about that. Necessary being. Okay, who remembers what necessary being is? Chris? It can't not exist. It's impossible for it to not exist. It must exist. Such as the laws of logic. It would be impossible for them to not be. So necessary being is associated. It's very much, this idea of necessary being is very much related to this argument. If you don't understand the concept of necessary being, then you won't understand the argument. Okay. So contingent being is basically a being that could exist. It doesn't need to. It owes its existence to something else. But the key thing is contingent. It doesn't have to exist. At least the key thing within our thinking in this argument. Okay, so next slide is explain and defend the ontological argument. Okay, so there are several different versions of the ontological argument, and philosophers argue about which one is the most correct. Now, Anselm, I think this version is taken from some of the verbiage of Anselm. Anselm came up with the argument. Philosophers have kind of codified it in philosophical points. They're taking the verbiage and making it into formal philosophical deductive arguments. But basically, it goes like this. Anselm said that our understanding of God is that of a being which no greater can be conceived. So that's kind of a restatement of what Anselm said. When you're thinking of God, you're thinking of a being about which nothing greater can be conceived. That's what the thought implies. And again, when people, the atheists, well, that's how you're defining God, and you're defining God. If you define God that way, you're defining God into existence. Well, forget the word God. We'll just think of the thought of a greatest conceivable being. Call it whatever you want. A greatest conceivable being. We can conceive of a greatest conceivable being, a being about which none greater can be thought. So this idea, the idea of God, or we could replace the word God with the greatest conceivable being, exists within our mind. Okay? That's the second premise. Third premise, a being which exists both in the mind and in reality is greater than a being that exists only in the mind. Okay? In other words, if what you're conceiving of only exists in your head but doesn't exist in reality, you haven't conceived of, I can think of something greater, namely something that exists in your head and something that exists in reality. And so he would say, okay, next premise is, we cannot imagine something that is greater than God, therefore God exists. And so basically, this formulation of the argument basically says that you aren't conceiving of the greatest conceivable being if the being you're conceiving doesn't exist in reality. Because it would be greater to exist in reality than it would be to exist just in the mind. So, this argument has really come under attack there, like I said, there's lots of different ways of formulating. This one is probably the most successfully attacked, and I'll talk to you about why. Basically, let me finish my notes. Anselm is not arguing that because we can conceive of God, this somehow proves he exists. Rather, he is saying that the concept of a greatest conceivable being can be conceived not to exist. It's not because I conceive of it, it exists. It's I can't reasonably conceive of it not existing. That's what he's saying. Again, he's not saying because I can conceive of a conceivable being, therefore that being exists. It's I cannot reasonably conceive of that being not existing. That's the thrust of his argument. So, and Anselm said this is a quote from Anselm. And God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, and God assuredly exists so truly that it cannot be conceived not to exist. For it is not possible to conceive of a being which cannot be conceived not to exist. For it, let me start over because I ruined that one. Let's start over. Okay. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And God assuredly exists so truly that it cannot be conceived not to exist. For it is possible to conceive of a being which cannot be conceived not to exist, and this is greater than one which can be conceived not to exist. Hence, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived not to exist, it is not that than which none greater can be conceived. So basically what he's saying is if you can conceive of a being, the greatest conceivable being, as not existing, then you haven't conceived of the greatest conceivable being. But this is an incredible contradiction. There is then so truly a being than which nothing greater can be conceived to exist that it cannot even be conceived not to exist. This being, thou art, O Lord, our God. Powerful. It's just amazing. So, okay, so like I said, there are some objections. And again, I want to say, I can't say it hard enough because I guarantee you present this argument, somebody's going to say, well, you're just saying because I can conceive of something that therefore it exists, so I can conceive of a invisible pink uniform. There are, that's what people respond to this argument just like, I don't know, obscenely, just stupidly, like completely don't understand it. What he is saying is that it cannot be conceived not to exist. Simply because of what's being conceived is the greatest conceivable being. And so there's a crux to this, and the crux to this is that existence would make something greater than non-existence. That's the crux, right? And that part was hammered pretty hard by Kant, and we'll talk about Immanuel Kant's critique of the ontological argument. But there are different formulations that talk. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll go over it. But let's talk about Gonilot's objection. Gonilot was a monk, a fellow to Anselm. He criticized the argument, saying that one is forced by the logic of the argument to postulate the existence of all sorts of ridiculous things, like a most perfect island, for example, or a necessarily existent lion. So in response, one cannot really conceive of a greatest conceivable island in the case of islands, because there could always be one more palm tree or one more native dancing girl, right? Necessarily existent lions cannot be conceived of, cannot be conceived because it would have to exist in every possible world, and it doesn't make sense that a finite physical being would exist in every possible world. So these are some. This argument only works for the greatest conceivable being. It doesn't work for anything else. So, and really the key being is the key objection is this: these aren't necessary beings, because we can conceive of them as not existing. Well, this is not the case with the greatest conceivable being. And so, all right. Next one. So, explain Immanuel Kant's critique and respond to it. And every time I teach this, I have to remind myself, what did Kant mean? Because it takes some thinking. So basically, Kant argued, his argument was that existence is not a predicate. And every time I teach this lecture, I have to look up, what does he mean by existence is not a predicate? I keep forgetting, and I look at my notes, and my notes are not good enough, and I try to explain it better the next time, and hopefully I'm good with my explanation this time. This lecture needs more revision. I'll just say that. It's not fine-tuned like my other ones. So, Kant argued that existence is not a predicate. In other words, so these are my looking at like 50 different websites trying to understand what Kant meant. In other words, existence is not a property that a thing can possess or lack. Or in other words, when people assert that God exists, they are not saying that there is a God and he possesses the property of existence. So I really kind of need to talk about what is a property versus what is a substance. Okay? A substance is an individual thing. And we'll talk about this. This is going to be relevant to our next lecture. So, pay attention, because if you don't understand this, you definitely won't understand the issue when we get to the subject of the soul. So, this is an individual particular thing, right? But it possesses properties. It possesses the property of being able to hold liquid. It also possesses the property of having the color blue. It also has the property of words that are associated with coconut, right? By paper has the property of having language, content, right? It has the property of having content. So a property is something that is had by a substance. It's something that is had by a substance. And usually, when you speak of properties, you're using the word ness. So if I described a person as having kindness, or goodness, or their shirt has the property of redness, or it's the substance is the thing, the individual thing, and the property is had by the thing. Properties are had. Substances are not had, they just are. Okay? So existence. Is existence a property that something could be had? Or that could be had by something? Kant argued that it's not. And so by arguing, and so here's an example that Kant uses. Kant, I think Kant used it. I found it on a website. Basically, where am I? Oh, here we go. He says, if one conceives of a $100 bill, for example, existence does not add value to what is being conceived. It is still worth the same regardless of whether I have it or not. So if I have if I conceive of the substance of a $100 bill, right? It would have the property of being able to buy a bicycle, right? Or buy all of us dinner. At some restaurants, not others, but certainly at Little Caesars. We could have a pizza. Everybody could have a pizza. We could have 5 pizzas apiece. Right? So when we conceive of a $100 bill, we're conceiving of it having certain properties. What we're not conceiving of is existence. And existence doesn't add anything to the substance of what we're conceiving, right? Whether it exists or not, it's still going to have that same value. And it doesn't change anything. So Kant's argument, and it's a very powerful argument against the ontological argument. And basically, what he's saying is that existence is not a predicate. It's not something that... Where am I? Right. So this gets at the crux of the argument. The crux of the argument is that if one conceives of a being only existing in the mind, you haven't conceived of the greatest conceivable being, because I can conceive of a being that exists within the mind and reality, right? So that is a very powerful attack against the ontological argument. And I think it actually is the death blow to the first version that I've explained. I would not use Anselm's first version of the ontological argument, because Kant's critique is a valid critique of that argument. So, however, while existence in and of itself is not a property, necessary existence is a property. Because someone could have contingent being or have necessary being. And that's a different thing. Because now you're talking about the property of their being. The property of being necessary or the property of being contingent. Okay? So when you formulate it in that vernacular, that term, there's a different way of doing it. And actually Anselm himself formulated it this way in his writings. And again, these are summaries of basically taking his words and putting it into, summarizing his words and putting it into logical format. So this would be the second formulation of his argument, which includes the concept of necessary being. By definition, God is a being which none greater than can be imagined. A being that exists, a being that necessarily exists in reality is greater than a being that does not necessarily exist in reality. Thus, by definition, if God exists as an idea in the mind but does not exist necessarily, or does not necessarily exist in reality, then we can conceive of something greater than God. But we cannot imagine of something greater than God. Thus, if God exists in the mind as an idea, then God necessarily exists in reality. God exists in the mind as an idea, therefore God necessarily exists in reality. So again, it's just attaching that concept of necessary being, which is a predicate. It is a property. Now, there are different formulations of the argument. Bib, would you mind figuring out the AC? Okay. It's starting to get warm in here. All right. Let me just stop. Do you guys understand Kant's objection to the ontological argument? Do you understand the ontological argument?
Like,
You want to just talk? Let's talk for a minute.
well, for me though, like, I kind of get it, but then a lot of it for me, it just sounds, I don't know if I'm like understanding it wrong, but it just sounds, not circular, but it just sounds like you have to come already with this in mind, and then this, but since you have this, I don't know.
And that's actually a major critique of the argument, is that it's a circular argument, because you're starting with a concept that implies God's existence. But isn't that something that's being conceived? I mean, forget about forget about the word God. We just conceive about a being that a being that has the property of necessary being. You cannot reasonably conceive of that being not existing.
Can you say the property of necessary being?
Yes.
What does that mean?
So, the property of necessary being is that which cannot not be.
Could not be otherwise.
Right, could not be otherwise.
So it's the idea basically is if you have to go, if you can think of anything that's, what uses the word contingent, or that relies on something else, that just automatically gets thrown out because it.
Right. Because the greatest, this ontological argument would only work, it cannot work for anything that would be contingent, such as the greatest conceivable island, for example, because that we can conceive of that as not existing. And but a being, a necessary being, the greatest conceivable being that has the property of necessary being would have to exist in every would have to exist necessarily. In order, if you can conceive of it not existing necessarily, then you're not really conceiving of a necessary being.
So it's really kind of the idea for me that God, he has this ability to basically create everything in any possible world.
Well, let's deal with the possible world semantics. Actually, this formulation that I haven't said yet. But mostly I want to get at, do we understand Kant's, I'll talk about the possible world thing, because that's coming next. But before I talk about it, does everybody understand Kant's objection to I'm getting some no's. Okay, so a property is something that is had by a substance. No, a property could be of a necessary being. Well, properties, yeah, so that's a hard question.
God has a property.
Yeah, God has the property of being omniscient. God has the property of being omnipresent, omnipotent. He's got the property of being non-physical. He's got the property of...
I would argue that those are not properties, those are God. That is what God is. He almost...
Well, a property is... I mean, I don't...
You're almost running afoul of what's its dilemma.
Euthyphro? How so?
Almost, because now you're saying that God is this because of something else.
No. I'm not saying God is this because of something else. I'm saying that God possesses these things. It's something that God has. The substance of God, which is an immaterial, non-physical substance, he has properties. Properties and substance are related to each other. They're totally related. You don't want to they're definitely related to each other. So you have properties, right? Everything that exists has some form of property. Well, even necessary being, even God has properties. But, he doesn't have physical properties, right? We have physical properties, right? God doesn't have physical properties. But God has properties of eternality. He's got properties of, and these are things he's always had. These are things that he has. That make, and it's what he has that makes him what he is. So, it's, yeah. In fact, when you describe God, you're describing really the properties that he has. All right? If I was to describe you, I would describe the properties that you have, right? So, what Kant says, okay, so if we understand that properties are something that is had by a substance, the question is existence necessarily a property? And that's kind of confusing, but basically, if you think of the money example, I think that's kind of the best explanation. When I am conceiving of an idea, and I'm conceiving of a $100 bill, I have that concept of what it can do, right? What it is. Whether it exists right here in my hands or not, doesn't change the nature of what's being conceived. Right? It adds no value to it. It's still all the properties are there when I conceive of it. Existence doesn't add a property to it. And so Kant is saying that when you conceive of God, you're conceiving of a being that's all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving, and eternal, and transcendent. But existence doesn't add anything to what's being conceived, just like existence of the $100 doesn't add to anything being conceived. So that was his argument. And again, like I say, every time I teach this lecture, I have to remind myself, wait, how am I going to teach this again? Because his argument is hard to understand. But it's powerful. It really was like the death blow to this argument. And this argument is resurfaced in modern times because of this resurfacing of the idea of necessary being and the vernacular of possible worlds and using modal logic as using the semantics of possible worlds in modal logic. So, okay. So again, all other philosophers throughout history have made this argument. They've got different formulations of the argument. René Descartes has a different formulation of the argument. There's another American philosopher, I forget his name, has a different formulation of the argument. And philosophers have gone back and forth, whether it's good, whether it's bad. I believe Thomas Aquinas didn't like the argument. Some philosophers, I mean, you've got, again, there are people, even Christians, who are on both sides of the fence with this argument as to whether it's a good argument or not. Plantinga is a modern-day philosopher. He was the chair of the philosophy department at Notre Dame for a long time. I've talked about him when we talked about the evolutionary argument against naturalism, which I think is a fantastic argument. He basically formulated the argument this way. It's a different way that employs the semantics of possible worlds. Remember, what's a possible world? Basically, it's a way of describing reality that's logically consistent. A way of describing a possible reality that's logically existent. Okay. So understanding possible worlds is super important, again, for when we get going on the next lecture, or next part of the lecture. So, here's Plantinga's version. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world, because a maximally great being would be a necessary being. And again, it's this concept of necessary being, when you plug it into this ontological, it's essential when you plug it into this ontological argument, because a necessary being would exist in every possible world. And if you were to conceive of a maximally great being, you would be conceiving of a necessary being. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then a maximally great being exists in the actual world. So, if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. And so this is a way of formulating it, and again, it hangs on this whole idea of necessary being. And this idea of necessary being really is what gets around Kant's critique of the ontological argument. Yes?
So I guess it's on this one, the third one, which is kind of has me a little bit confused. I guess the question is, why does the great being need to exist, in a possible world, a world that is just the thought? If you can make that exist in that one, why does it have to exist in all the other ones?
Because
you can just make different possibilities. Oh, this one doesn't require that.
Okay. Because a maximally great being would be a necessary being. Just like you can't conceive of a possible world where the laws of logic do not exist, or where a married bachelor... This gets at what is necessary and what's possible and what's impossible. There's no possible world in which married bachelors exist. Right? You can't describe a possible world in which there's married bachelors. You also can't describe a world where there's no God, because the concept implies a necessary being. I have a video at this point. I've talked enough. To answer your question, I'm going to throw up a video, and I'm going to throw up some objections to the video, or talk about like response to objections to the ontological argument. So, you want to hit the lights?
Alvin Plantinga's modal ontological argument is probably the best argument for the existence of God. It uses the laws of modal logic and acts similar to a mathematical proof. This is probably why a lot of people have a hard time understanding it and simply dismiss it. There are many great videos on the internet right now that give a great analysis of the ontological argument, yet many people ignore these videos because they find them too confusing. In this video, I'm going to try to articulate the argument in an easy way to understand, because if you're a theist, then it's important to understand this argument because when understood correctly, it is impossible to refute. If you don't believe in a God, then it would probably be a good idea to understand it, so you don't appear foolish by misunderstanding it. To start, here's how the modal ontological argument works. Premise 1. It is possible that God exists. Premise 2. If it is possible that God exists, then God exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3. If God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds. Premise 4. If God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. And premise 5. If God exists in the actual world, then God exists. Now, if you're like me when you first heard this, you're probably asking, well, wait, that doesn't make any sense. The logic of some of those premises doesn't add up. That's okay, because we're going to look at it closer so you can understand it. First, you should understand that when philosophers say a possible world, they mean a hypothetical situation. It is generally a way for philosophers to test an idea to see if it's logical by asking, could it exist in a possible world like ours? However, the one thing people seem to misunderstand the most in the argument is how God is defined. Some atheists say we're just imagining God into existence, like this clever bunch.
So here's my proof that a unicorn exists, and I actually wrote this passage. So let's define a unicorn as a magical equine being that has one horn and exists. By the above definition, such a being must exist. Therefore, a unicorn exists.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the ontological argument.
It's very hard to believe that there are people that use that, but there are.
The fact that the idea is there, that so I can believe that I'm green and polka dotted.
Apparently,
Okay.
as long
Yes,
as
apparently.
So, okay, ladies and gentlemen, I am green with purple polka dots. And since I have stated that, therefore it must be true.
since you can imagine
Yes.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the problem. They are falling into the typical error of misunderstanding how God is defined, and because of their ignorance, they are concluding that the argument doesn't work. So we need to look at how God is actually defined and how it differs from how you would define a unicorn. Now, there are three ways to define a being or an entity in the ontological argument. An entity can either be impossible, which means it exists in no possible worlds. An example would be a square circle. An entity can be contingent, which means it exists in some possible worlds, like a unicorn. A unicorn could exist in some possible worlds, but not in others. Last, an entity can be necessary, which means it has to exist in all possible worlds. Now, what do we mean when we say something necessarily has to exist in all possible worlds? Well, examples of necessary entities are numbers, absolute truths, and shape definitions. For example, take the number 2. No one created it, it just exists necessarily. It can't not exist. Take a shape definition for another example, such as a square must have 4 sides. A square cannot exist with only 3 sides, because that would be logically incoherent in any possible world. So a necessary entity is something that cannot be false or fail to exist in any possible world. Therefore, necessarily, it has to exist in all possible worlds. So when we talk of God in this argument, we are saying that if he exists, he would have to be a necessary entity, because God is defined as a maximally great being. And a maximally great being is defined as a being that possesses all qualities that are better to have, which we define as great-making properties. Other examples are love, wisdom, and power. A maximally great being would also have to have these properties to their maximal extent. He would also possess no qualities that are bad to have, such as imperfection or corruption. These are defined as lesser-making properties. But most of all, he would have to possess the great-making property of necessity, because being necessary is a property that would be better to have. Now looking back at the terms we defined earlier, if God was contingent, he wouldn't be maximally great, because he would only exist in some worlds, and would be less than great than if he existed in all worlds. Now the idea of God being necessary is consistent with Scripture. Colossians 1:16 says, "For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him." So when skeptics try to debunk this argument by going through the premise with a unicorn in place of God, they are trying to define God in the same way you would define a contingent being. Whereas when we use God in the ontological argument, we are saying God is more than just contingent. He is maximally great, and anything maximally great must be a necessary entity, or it wouldn't be maximally great. So understanding how God is defined in the argument, let's go through the premises again. Premise 1. It is possible that God, a maximally great and necessary being, exists. Premise 2. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible worlds, then a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds. Remember, if a maximally great being exists, then he has to be a necessary entity, because a contingent being cannot be maximally great. Premise 4. If a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds, then a maximally great being exists in the actual world, because the actual world is counted as one of the possible worlds. Premise 5. If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. And the conclusion is, a maximally great being exists. So does it feel convincing? Well, not really. But when it boils down, it's not a matter of how you feel. What matters is what is logically coherent. So hopefully now that you know how God is defined in the argument, you can understand how the ontological argument works. Are there objections to the argument? Yes, but only in premise 1, since the other premises just follow modal logic and are uncontroversial. The only way for skeptics to debunk this argument is to show that it is impossible for a maximally great being to exist. The most common way this is tried is with the omnipotence paradox. It is most commonly presented like this. Can God create a stone so heavy that even he can't move? If God cannot create the stone, then he is not all-powerful. But if God can create the stone and can't move it, then he is still not all-powerful. Therefore, the idea of God is impossible. However, this attempt is debunked in the question itself as a logical absurdity. Asking can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy even he can't move implies that omnipotence is defined as able to do the logically impossible, which is not consistent with the definition of omnipotence. No one who believes in an omnipotent God believes God can do the logically impossible. The Bible has verses that state it's impossible for God to do certain things. Asking the question is like asking, can an omnipotent being create a square with 3 sides? Or can an omnipotent being tell you the shape of purple? Or can an omnipotent being tote an 11? It's just gibberish. All these questions are logically incoherent and cannot exist in any possible world, so you cannot expect them to be answered. Now you might be asking, well, why can't God do the logically impossible? He is all-powerful, so he should be able to do anything. Well, you need to understand that logic derives from order. Without order, nothing makes sense, including existence. So you cannot use logical absurdities to disprove the existence of God. Because if logical absurdities were in a world along with God, then essentially nothing in that world could actually exist. So once again, you cannot use logical absurdities to disprove the existence of God, especially in modal logic. If one side uses logic to prove the existence of God, the other side cannot step outside of logic to disprove God. That'd be like a football game where one team gets to use machetes. This is why the omnipotence paradox is not accepted in academia as a valid argument. There are of course other objections to the argument. However, I'm not going to address them now, because this video is intended to be an introduction to the ontological argument, and I feel I've already overloaded your head with too much information. I cover the most popular objections to the argument in another video, which you can check out later. If this video still has you confused, I would recommend watching it again. The ontological argument is not an argument that some people can fully grasp right away, so please, reflect on the idea before you dismiss it. It took me a little bit of reflecting before I fully understood it, and I wouldn't expect anything different from someone else. In the information section below, I've provided links to other great videos on the ontological argument. I hope you'll check them out and continue to research and study this amazing argument.
There's another one I want you to see. You like that one?
Yeah, that was very helpful. Alvin
planting
this is
What?
it's still like, I don't know.
Okay. So when I was explaining it to my uncle, this was the video that got him, the uncle, to understand. It was William Lane Craig explaining objections to the ontological argument. So maybe this one will be helpful.
Number 5, the possibility of God's existence. Now, I've rarely shared this argument in a public lecture before, not because I think it's unsound, but because it's so abstract that students are apt to think that it's either a trick or else that they just don't understand it. But tonight I'm going to go out on a limb and share it with you. Now, in order to understand this argument, you first need to understand what philosophers mean by possible worlds. A possible world is just a way the world might have been. It's a complete description of reality. So a possible world is not a planet or a universe or any kind of concrete object. It's just a world description. The actual world is the description that is true. Other possible worlds are descriptions that might have been true, but are not in fact true. To say that something exists in some possible world is to say that there is some description of reality which includes that entity. To say that something exists in every possible world is to say that no matter which description is true, the entity will be included in that description. So, for example, unicorns do not in fact exist, but there is some possible world in which unicorns exist. On the other hand, many mathematicians think that numbers exist in every possible world. They exist necessarily. Now, with that background in mind, consider the ontological argument, which was discovered in 1011 by the monk Anselm of Canterbury. God, says Anselm, is by definition the greatest being conceivable. If you could conceive of anything greater than God, then that would be God. So, by definition, God is the greatest conceivable being, a maximally great being. So, what would such a being be like? Well, he would be all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, and he would exist in every logically possible world. A being which lacked any of those properties would not be maximally great. We could conceive of something even greater. But what that implies is that if God's existence is even possible, then it follows that God must exist. For if a maximally great being exists in any possible world, it exists in all of them. That's part of what it means to be maximally great, to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good in every logically possible world. So, if God's existence is even possible, he exists in every logically possible world, and therefore in the actual world. Now, we can summarize this argument as follows. Number one, it's possible that a maximally great being, aka God, exists. 2, if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. 3, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. 4, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. 5, therefore, a maximally great being exists in the actual world. 6, therefore, a maximally great being exists. 7, therefore, God exists. Now, it might surprise you to learn that steps 2 through 7 of this argument are relatively uncontroversial. Most philosophers agree that if God's existence is even possible, then he must exist. So the whole question is premise one. Is God's existence possible? Well, what do you think? The atheist has to maintain that it's impossible that God exists. He has to say that the concept of God is logically incoherent, like the idea of a married bachelor or a round square. But the problem is that the concept of God just doesn't appear to be incoherent in that way. The idea of a being which is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good in every logically possible world seems perfectly coherent. Moreover, as we've seen, there are other arguments for God's existence which at least suggest that it's logically possible that God exists. So, I'll simply leave it to you tonight. Do you think that it's possible that God exists? If you do, then it follows logically that God does exist.
Premise two?
Yeah, what is it for?
Well, okay, it depends on which one you're looking at. Are you looking at the one on the notes or the one in?
In the video.
Okay.
Because I thought.
Well, can you remind me what it was?
I think it's just God exists in some possible world.
Right.
Which doesn't make sense to me because when he earlier explained what God means, and that God means that he has to exist in every possible world, why is there the premise that says he exists in some possible world? I mean,
Right.
it's not possible that he exists in some possible world because he has to exist in all.
Well, if he exists in some, he exists in all. So basically what the first premise is really getting at is that God is possible.
Yeah.
And simply by saying he's possible, it's using the vernacular, using the semantics, using the verbiage of possible world semantics, so that it follows in the flow utilizes this idea of possible worlds. Because when I conceive of a possible world, I'm simply saying that it could exist. Like when I say unicorns exist in some possible world.
Yeah, that's why I would skip the second one. I don't understand when the second one's even there.
Okay, if he exists in some possible world, then he would exist in all possible worlds. See, unicorn would not exist in all possible worlds.
To me, it
Right.
makes more sense the other way around. If he exists in all possible worlds, then he would exist in some possible
Right,
worlds.
but then you're starting with your conclusion. Basically what this formulation of the argument is basically forcing forcing people to confront the idea that basically what it's doing is it's eliminating this formulation of the argument, Plantinga's version of the ontological argument, not Anselm's version of the ontological argument, but Plantinga's version of the ontological argument, cuts out the idea of God being possible, but not actually exist. Yeah, God might exist.
You could exist, you do exist, you exist everywhere, and then it doesn't go well. That's the first three, right?
So, okay, there's three types of being. This goes back to what ultimately, there's impossible, right? A being that is impossible, a being that is contingent, and a being that is necessary.
Yeah, I
Right.
get that. I would just from hearing, it is possible that a maximally great being exists, and since I know what a maximally great being is defined as, I would go right to, it has to exist in all worlds, in all possible worlds. Not just in some
Wait,
possible
what are you
worlds.
starting with?
The first one, it is possible that a maximally great being exists, and I know what the definition of a maximally great being is.
Okay.
Necessary.
Yeah, necessary, and also it has to exist in all worlds, in all possible worlds. So I would go right to the third
Fourth one.
Exist.
third one, that he exists in all of them.
Okay.
Because just the definition of God means that he exists in all of them. He doesn't like.
Right, but when you go, I mean, the reason you would include that would be the reason you would include number two on this sheet. Number two on this sheet is to show this idea of, you there are people who believe that God exists, that would believe that God exists in some possible world, but not all. And so when you go from premise 2 to premise 3, you're employing that concept of necessary being.
It's basically just an explanation.
It helps to explain, because what you're trying to, the very purpose of the argument is try to eliminate the idea of God possibly existing. Basically, what the argument does is it says God is either necessary or impossible. And that's why he was, in this video, Dr. Craig was basically saying, I didn't defend premise 1. Premise 1, I left it up to you. Premise 1 is the most attacked premise, where people will try to use arguments to say that God can't exist in any possible world. But once you say that he does exist in some possible world, then he exists. Premise 2 is basically a restatement of premise 1 in possible world semantics, because the argument employs possible world semantics. I get what you're saying. It's a restatement of premise 2, but it's a statement of it using the vernacular of possible world semantics. Okay. Have I confused you yet?
No,
So
other
can
than
you-
that, I understand.
Yeah.
Can you just repeat? Like premise 2 is for proving that it is contingent. No, for it being necessary.
Well, okay, premise 2 is a restatement of premise 1
Yeah.
using possible world semantics. And when you jump from premise 2 to premise 3, basically what you're doing is employing... Okay. Okay, you're good?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So if you aren't confused yet, now we got to move on to the more confusing one. The case for the existence of the soul. Yes. All right, so case for the soul. Again, these are rough notes, and this is a lecture that I need to spend more time fine-tuning, and I planned on doing it, but I just didn't have enough time and was racing to get some thoughts that I knew were somewhere, but I couldn't find them, and wanted to include them and change the verbiage of the language, because a lot of it's cut and paste from different blogs and stuff. So it's I try to take the stuff from the philosophers and give it to you guys, because if I have to rechange the verbiage, because when they talk, it's really hard. You have to think about what they're saying, and analyze philosophical language. When philosophers talk, it's very, very hard to read, and so I'm going to have to do some translation here with my notes that I haven't done yet. When we talk about the nature, we need to talk about, when we talk about the nature of the soul, we're talking about the nature of consciousness. What is consciousness? And again, when we talk about the nature of something, we're talking about it's basically a substance, and we're talking about a property. Okay, and again, as I said before, when I was talking about the ontological argument, that a substance is an individual particular thing, whereas a property is an attribute of a substance. It's had by the thing. So an apple, for example, would be an individual thing. It has the property, the apple would be a substance. An apple has the property of being red. Again, the property is had by the substance. Okay. Substances are not in other things, nor are they had by other things, whereas properties are in things and had by them. So again, a rock has the property of being hard. The substance is the rock is not had by anything, it's just the rock. But the property of hardness is had by the rock. So substances have properties. Okay? You get that? Substances have properties. Substances have properties, right? What kind of properties does Rod Walters have? He what? He has the property of having hair. What else does he have? What other properties does Rod have? He has the property of being able to write. He's writing notes, right? Okay, so that pizza has the property of tastiness, right? Has the property of having pepperonis, the property of being made of dough, or doughness, right? Yeah, again, a property can be used if you see if you hear the word ness. If you can say it with a ness at the end, it's a property. Okay. Awesomeness would be a property. Redness, goodness, happiness. These are all properties, right? Whereas substances are things that have properties. Okay, so hopefully we get that. Moving on. So key terms: physicalism, property dualism, and substance dualism. So basically, physicalism is this idea that mental properties and brain events are the same thing. So the mind is basically the brain. That a brain event that occurs in the brain is the same thing that as a mental event. Okay. And basically, a physicalist would say that all exists, all that exists are physical entities with physical properties. There are no such thing as non-physical mental properties. Everything that exists is a physical thing with a physical property.
Like
Okay.
material thought is just some sort of
It's an illusion.
illusion?
It's an illusion or
A chemical process. in
it's
the
a
brain.
chemical process in the brain that has the illusion of being a mental property, but it's actually just a physical event in the brain. That's what most
Material.
materialists believe. And this issue gets the field of psychology all mixed up because psychology is a study of the brain, right? Or a study of the mind, right? And the mind and the brain, and they get really confused when it comes to this issue, and it's really interesting, because the field of psychology wants to be very scientific, right? That's their endeavor. Their endeavor is to study the mind and behavior like you would a science.
But they also want to start including morality in there too.
Well, you set that aside, but they're studying behavior patterns the way a scientist would be studying chemical reactions, right? And they're assuming that there are physical things causing, mental.
You have had some pretty good experience with this, haven't you? With some of the people that some little thing wrong in the brain.
Yeah, I mean, well, I do have a minor in psychology, so I've, studied psychology quite a bit. I'm interested in It's an interesting topic. It really is. But this is where it gets real funky, is this issue with the brain. Now, the people who really study neuropsych, my brother is getting his PhD in neuropsychology. And out of all the arguments that he has found most interesting, my brother Zach, we've talked, the ontological argument, these two arguments were interesting to Zach. None of the other ones really, but for whatever reason, these two really were engaging to him. And, one of the things he told me is that his teachers are aware, and one of the things he's learned about in his studies is that there is this mind-body problem, and that they haven't figured it out yet. That where is consciousness in the brain, and what can consciousness be described in physical terms, and it presents the problem is we know so much about the brain, and we still don't know what it is or where it is, or the scientists are it's a very puzzling subject.
Isn't that when they were trying to find something that explains homosexuality in the brain, but they can't because there's nothing physical?
Well, okay, so where it really gets confusing is there actually are things in the brain that cause behavior patterns. For example, do I want to get ahead of my notes?
Yeah.
I always get them ahead of my notes. And then I go back to my notes. I'm like, wait, we already talked about this. Such as, like, if I were to stimulate certain parts of your amygdala, you would cower in fear. And like, ah, you know, and they can do these experiments with animals and rats, and send little electrode pulses to different parts of the brain, and and it will cause certain behaviors. All right. So one thing that they can prove with science is that there's a causal relationship between the brain and the mind. Okay, and for that reason, people assume that the mind and the brain have the same identity. And I want to talk to you about why that can't possibly be. Okay? Just because there is a causal relationship does not mean they have the same identity. And we'll talk about that. That's actually the main crux of the argument, is that identity is trying to prove that they don't have the same identity. Yes? If you ask too many questions...
Isn't it like, I would imagine that you could only, can they stimulate actually things that you do, then, or can they only stimulate things you can perceive? Because I can perceive fear, but can they
Right.
control me?
Moral choices. Well,
pick up my pen and put it here.
Right. So this kind of gets at what she was saying, and yes, I probably didn't fully explain her thought. There are you could call final causes, right? Like, if I'm cowering in fear, I might make the choice to go and run, right? And the question of what caused that choice, was it a there's certain behaviors that are like literally knee-jerk reactions. Like if I bang on your...
When you're in fear, like your pupils are bigger or something like that, you're shivering, that's already something that is physically happening.
Right. So the physicalists would say that basically there is no free will. So that all behavior is the product of brain chemistry that's a result of your genes, a combination of your genes and your environment. And there's a whole field of study called sociobiology. And we talked about sociobiological ethics when we covered the moral argument. And this bleeds into that realm of there are physical reasons why somebody might choose to be, that would be what is called a final cause, or a reason why they would choose to behave a certain way. For example, if you grew up in a family that was extremely violent, right, and you were taught and ingrained, if somebody intimidates you, you hit them, and it was, your brain is growing, and as it's growing, it's building these neural connections, and you end up with people with conduct disorder and all sorts of things. But ultimately, there are environmental factors, right? And so we, as believers in free choice, would accept that to a degree, but not to the point where, when it comes to morality, there's different kinds of causes, right? You have an efficient cause and a final cause. And we're getting way off track, and I've got a half hour to finish these notes. Yeah.
They were doing this test, and like they were probing the brain, and they could make somebody's arm moving up, and then they were asking the person, well, what's going on? And you said, like, I feel that you're doing something in my brain, and I can perceive that my arm is going up, but I can notice this independently of you making my arm go up.
Right. So there's no doubt that there's I don't think anybody has any doubt that there's a causal relationship between the brain and consciousness. That the mind affects the brain and the brain affects the mind. They connect each other. The question is whether they have the same identity or not. That's what we want to get into. Okay? It's a little bit different than when it comes to moral choices. That's a whole lot more complicated. If we talk about that, we'll end up talking about Calvinism, because that relates to Calvinism, and then we'll be here all night. I'll never get to my notes. But it was a very good question. Okay. The question is whether brain events are the same as physical events. And if they are different, mental properties are the same thing as brain events. And if they are have the same identity, if they don't have the same identity, what possesses the mental properties? Is it the brain or is it the soul? So the first thing is we got to separate the identity of mental events from brain events. Okay, so a physicalist would believe that mental properties and brain events are the same thing. That consciousness is an illusion. It's really just, we have the illusion of free will. We have the illusion of consciousness, but in reality it's just brain. Everything's determined by our genes and our environment. There really can't be morality in such a situation. You just are trained to behave a certain way, and so you do. You don't really have choice. And so I believe that an atheist who is truly consistent must be a physicalist and a determinist, believing that that all of morality and everything's just biochemically determined by your genes and your environment.
No free will.
No free will. It'd be impossible. Some atheists recognize that, many do not. But I think the ones who do recognize it are at least you can credit them for being consistent. So a property property dualism is, once we've separated mental events from brain events, you now have property dualism. Okay? There are two categories of property dualists. Mere property dualists who believe that the immaterial mental properties are actually had by the brain, and substance dualists who believe that the mental properties are had by the soul. Okay, so hopefully you've grasped that, because it's important, because most Christians are substance dualists, but a lot of them are not. There are Christians who are mere property dualists who do not believe in a separate substance called the soul. But my reading and you can get into that. There are Christians that debate this issue, and just be aware that they exist. And my reading of Scripture is pretty clear that it's a separate thing. But there are Christians who hold all sorts of different views. But some surprisingly very intelligent people that I respect are, no, not him, but certain people that I do know and respect would hold to mere property dualism. Okay. So you have this debate, again, there's this debate between physicalism and dualism that you first have to duke out, and then you have this debate between property dualists and substance dualists. Okay? And a mere property dualist believes that mental properties are had by the brain, that they do believe in non-physical, immaterial mental properties, but the thing that has it is the brain. Whereas a substance dualist believes that mental properties are had by a separate substance, an immaterial substance that is the soul. Okay? Whew, it's confusing. All right. Okay, here is the crux of this debate. So first we're going to tackle this debate between physicalism and dualism. And remember, there's two types of dualists. So once we agree, once we get to the point where, okay, dualism, then we have to debate between mere property dualism and substance dualism. So the first debate is between physicalism and dualism. Physicalism is the belief that there is no distinction between brain events and mental properties. Okay, dualism says that there is a difference between mental properties and brain events. Okay? So, Leibniz's law of the indisseminability of identicals basically says this: if you have truly identical things, then there really is only one thing you're talking about, not two. Anything that is true or even could be true, get that, or even could be true of one would apply to the other. So if we say it could be true that Nate was not teaching at the Bible college right now, then it would be true that you would not be talking about Nate. I'm not coming. Is that not a good example?
Because I was confused on that one, because if not, we could talk about you even if you weren't here.
Yeah.
Like,
But I am here right now. So if it could be, if you're speaking about something, it would have all the if you're take for example mental properties and brain events. If they have the same identity, then there could be nothing that would be true of one that wouldn't be true of the other, because they would have the same identity. Okay? So the question is, are they identical? Do they have the same identity? And if there was even something that theoretically could be true of one that couldn't theoretically be true of the other, they wouldn't have the same identity either. That's crucial for when we get to substance dualism. But again, if something truly has the same identity, if brain events and mental properties truly have the same identity, everything that is true of brain events would also be true of mental properties. Okay? And there could be nothing that would be true, that even theoretically could be true of one that wouldn't theoretically be true of the other. Okay? All right.
so in that example,
Because if you can think of examples where it would be theoretically not true of this to have this and this to not have this, then you no longer have identity. Do you want to? Yeah, this one's a hard one. This is the hardest one, for sure. This is the hardest argument.
So we couldn't talk about you and you not being here is basically the example you're giving for this condition.
Or if it's theoretically possible that I am a leprechaun, then I would not. Or let's say it's theoretically possible that you could speak of me as someone who has the property of having blue eyes, then I wouldn't have. It's not. It's not me. Well, okay. 'Cause now you're talking about properties. I'm not giving very good examples.
Same sense and same.
Anselm?
Yeah.
We're not really talking about Anselm, but
No, like that is true in the same sense and true in the same. What was the other one?
Well, we're just
basically what I'm talking about is identity.
in the mind. This is like if
Does it have the same? Does mental events have the same identity as brain? Does mental events have the same identity as brain events? If they have the same identity, then physicalism is true. If they do not have the same identity, then dualism is true. Showing that the brain can cause events in the mind, or that the mind can cause events in the brain, does not prove that they have the same identity. And one thing that psychologists make a big deal about this guy, he used to work on the railroad. It was in the early studying of the brain, there was a guy who had a railroad spike shoot right through his eyeball and out of his skull, and it affected his prefrontal cortex. And he used to be a church-going guy, a married guy, and after this brain event, he was mean. He was cussing all the time. Became an alcoholic, a womanizer, and just his behavior changed dramatically. And brain events do cause changes in physical event. They are causally related. Okay, but that's not enough to prove identity. They have to have identity in order for physicalism. They have to have the same identity in order for physicalism to be true. So, let's keep going. So addressing physicalism. If physicalism is true, then everything that is true of the mental events or brain events would also be true of mental events, and vice versa. If we can find just one thing, or even one possibly true of consciousness that is not true of the brain slash body, then physical states, and its physical states, or vice versa, then dualism is established. So, the case for dualism is really simple. You just find some instance where they can't possibly be the same thing. And so with regard to the relationship of causation, it may be that brain events cause, or the cause, I already went over this. I'm going to skip ahead. Physicalism needs identity to make the case. So you will search in vain through physics or chemistry textbooks to find consciousness included in any description of matter. As with matter, it is hard to give a definition of mental entities, but examples of mental entities we can easily supply them. So, when we talk about consciousness, what is consciousness? Well, consciousness involves sensations, states. So these would be examples of mental properties. So, states of awareness or sentience, a mode of consciousness. There's external sensations, which are experiences of things outside of yourself, such as the tree or this table that I'm looking at. There are internal sensations, awareness of states within yourself, like itches or pains or feelings, itches or pains. And then there are emotions, which are a subclass of sensations, and they are forms of awareness of things. That you have thoughts. Mental content that can be expressed in an entire sentence that exists only while it is being thought. So right now I'm thinking about this thing. But then there are beliefs, and a belief is a person's view, which is accepted to a varying degree of strength, of how things really are. At any given time, one may have beliefs that they are not currently thinking of. So right now I have thoughts about the Stanley Cup finals, and I have thoughts about where to go diving, and I have thoughts about stuff that I'm not thinking, beliefs about those things that I'm not thinking about. So I could hold those beliefs while they wouldn't be thoughts. Whereas I have desire. Another example of consciousness would be desires, felt inclinations to do something or to have an experience of certain things. Acts of volition, so free choice and exercise of power and endeavoring to do a thing, usually for the sake of some purpose or end. So those would be examples of mental properties. Whereas physical properties, they have, when you talk about physical properties, you're talking about something that's publicly accessible. You're talking about something that's spatially located, things that can be described in terms of physics and chemistry. And then you have something, one thing they don't do is physical properties don't have genuine teleological behavior, such it does not undergo a change for the sake of something else, So, dualists argue that these 5 states are examples of genuine mental physical properties. So mental states are in no sense physical states. They possess 5 features that physical states don't have. So mental events, there's a certain what it's like of a mental event that would not be true of a physical event. You cannot describe physical events in terms of what it's like. Mental states have intentionality. There's a oneness or aboutness. It's directed towards an object. A thought may be about a moon. A physical state is not about something. You cannot describe physical states as being about something. But a thought is about something. I think it should be about. Cross out oneness and just circle aboutness. There's an aboutness to mental properties that's not true of physical properties. Mental states are inner, private, and immediate to the subject having them. All right, whereas physical states are publicly accessible. Mental states require subjective ontology, namely, mental states are necessarily owned. They're first person. They're owned by first person sentient subjects who have them. They are my thoughts. There is a me to my thoughts, to consciousness. That's not true of physical properties. There's not a me-ness to physical states. Mental states fail to have crucial features such as spatial extension or location that characterize physical states and in general cannot be described using physical terms. So if I say 2 plus 2, how much does that weigh? How much does 2 plus 2 weigh? What's its electrical current? Where is it located? Can you describe it in physical terms? No, you can't. So there are things that are true of mental properties that are not true of physical properties, and vice versa. And so because of that, they cannot have the same identity. So if they don't have the same identity, then you have dualism. Okay, and this is a really big point because it really kicks the butt of many. This is a very powerful philosophical argument that consciousness cannot be described in physical terms, and so you have to have this immaterial property of mental events. That it's not a physical thing. Mental events are not physical. Yet, if you are committed to a materialistic, naturalistic worldview, this is very, very confounding. And so it ends up being a very powerful argument. So we're not done, but what we've done at this point is hopefully, and I'm running out of time, hopefully what we've done is we've taken away the mental properties from physical properties. And most Christian apologists just stop there and say, because at this point you've hit 90% of all the atheists, and you can go straight into an argument for the existence of God. There are those rare ones that are property dualists, and they are also committed to a naturalistic, materialistic worldview, but they're very rare. And I don't even understand where they could, it doesn't make sense where would mental properties come from, in a purely naturalistic, materialistic worldview. But at this point, I want to share a video that I just found, and it's really short. You want to hit the lights?
God is the best explanation of intentional states of consciousness in the world. Philosophers are puzzled by states of intentionality. Intentionality is the property of being about something or of something. It signifies the object-directedness of our thoughts. For example, I can think about my summer vacation, or I can think of my wife. No physical object has this sort of intentionality. A chair or a stone or a glob of tissue like the brain is not about or of something else. Only mental states or states of consciousness are about other things. As a materialist, Dr. Rosenberg recognizes this fact and so concludes that on atheism, there really are no intentional states. Dr. Rosenberg boldly claims that we never really think about anything. But this seems incredible. Obviously, I am thinking about Dr. Rosenberg's argument. This seems to me to be a reductio ad absurdum of atheism. By contrast, on theism, because God is a mind, it's hardly surprising that there should be finite minds. Thus, intentional states fit comfortably into a theistic worldview. So, we may argue, 1, if God did not exist, intentional states of consciousness would not exist. 2, but intentional states of consciousness do exist. 3, therefore, God exists.
So that was at a debate, apparently at Purdue. All right, so okay, so we are now dealing with the modal argument for dualism, for property dualism. Okay, so the first step is to show that mental events are not the same thing as brain events by showing that there are things you cannot describe, you cannot even describe reasonably mental events using physical terms for those reasons that I just went through. You can't, the physical brain events do not have an physical events do not have an aboutness or an ofness. Okay. Another thing you could say is that like a thought can either be true or false, but a physical state isn't true or false. It just is, right? So there's this. This goes to that aboutness to the aspect of mental events. Mental events have an aboutness to them that physical states, physical anything, you can't describe physical things in that way. So if there's something true of mental events that is not true of physical events or brain states, then they don't have the same identity. Just because there is a causal relationship between the two does not mean they have the same identity. Following me? Okay. So now we deal with the issue of the modal argument for property dualism. So, thought experiments have been rightly central to debates about personal identity. And in these thought experiments, some argue in the following way. Because a certain state of affair, S, and S would be, for example, a state of affair, we just put S for anything, but we'll just use the example of the disembodied existence of Smith. So the disembodied, we'll say the disembodied existence of Victor, okay? So because of a certain state of affairs, the S, the state of affairs of Victor being disembodied, is conceivable. This provides justification for thinking that S is metaphysically possible. Okay? So, basically, if you can conceive of it, it's at least metaphysically possible. And this is sort of related to this idea of possible worlds, you know. We can reasonably conceive of Victor dying, but Victor's consciousness still existing without his body. Okay? Now, if S is possible, then certain implications follow about what is not essential to personal identity. So, for any existence X and Y, if I have good grounds for believing that I can conceive of X without Y or vice versa, then I have good grounds for believing that X is not essential to or identical to Y or vice versa. And so because I can conceive of Victor as existing without his body, then Victor is not essential to his body. Because this is a tough one.
Wait,
Okay.
Are you saying that that's true? Because if it is, that doesn't make any sense. Because you can still be alive and not have a conscious state, right? Like in a coma. But you can't have a conscious state without you actually being alive because you're dead.
But we can conceive, listen, we can conceive of you existing as a conscious state without your body. But we can't conceive of your body as existing without your body, or your brain existing without your brain.
Okay, maybe I misread it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a
So,
good question.
so you know,
Okay,
I can,
yeah.
because I can conceive of the one existing without the other, then they don't have the same identity. It's the same. It's the same argument against.
Yeah, I thought you were saying that you could have a conscience without being alive, and my bad.
Okay, sorry.
No,
Maybe I wasn't clear. But thankful, because for whatever I said, a lot of people went, "Oh yeah, I get it." Okay, so it was important that. Okay, so let me say it again. So basically, if Victor is essential to his body, then we wouldn't be able to conceive of him existing without his body. But because we can conceive of him as existing without his body, they don't have the same identity. And this is an argument that major philosophers, the head of the philosophy department at Oxford, Richard Swinburne, has made this argument. This is this isn't just like a hokey argument. This is an argument that's held by prominent philosophers.
just the idea that it's conceivable.
Right. The fact that it's conceivable means it's not doesn't have the essential. It's not essential to the identity of Victor. His body is not essential to the identity of, him. And so, let's apply these insights about conceivability and possibility to the modal argument for substance dualism. And the argument comes in many forms, but can be fairly stated as follows. The law of identity. If X is identical to, so remember we talked about the law of identity. If X is identical to Y, then whatever is true of X is true of Y, and vice versa. I can strongly conceive of myself existing disembodied. If I can strongly conceive of some state of affairs, S, that S possibly obtains, then I have grounds for believing that S is at least possible. Okay? I'm not saying that it's metaphysical. It's like saying in some possible world I could be disembodied. I could exist without my body. If I can strongly conceive of myself as existing without my body, I could at least describe myself as, it's metaphysically possible. Okay, but if it's metaphysically possible, then, therefore, I have grounds for believing of myself that it is possible for me to be disembodied. If some entity X is such that it is possible for X to exist without Y, then X is not identical to Y, and Y is not essential to X. So this is an argument for substance dualism. It is an argument that basically says that if they had the same identity, I wouldn't be able to conceive of them as not existing without one another, because they have the same identity. If my brain is me, or if my brain has consciousness, then it's not really conceivable of it being separate. And so, again, this is a hard one for me, even me to understand. This is the hardest one that I go through. But in this whole series, let me finish what's going on. So my body is such that it is possible to exist, but my body is not such that it is impossible to exist disembodied. I.e., my body is essential to my body. Okay? Therefore, I have good grounds for believing of myself that I am not identical to my body and that my physical body is not essential to me. This could be used, so, moving on, we can now use this as an argument for the existence of God. So if we believe that the self is this, consciousness is this immaterial thing, whether it's an immaterial property or it's an immaterial substance that has immaterial properties, genuinely non-physical states exist. So this is the argument. Genuinely non-physical states exist. There is an explanation for the existence of mental states. Personal explanation is different from natural explanation. The explanation for the existence of mental states is either personal or natural scientific explanation. The explanation is not a natural scientific one because you can't go from matter to mind. Mind is a completely different thing than matter, and so you don't get when a magician pulls a rabbit out of J.P. Moreland says it this way, when a magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat, you know that there was a rabbit in there because something doesn't come from nothing. And so when we have consciousness doesn't just come out willy-nilly from material processes. It's not, it can't even be described in physical terms. And so, it is, anyways, sorry, I'm getting off. So the explanation is not a natural scientific one. Therefore, the explanation is a personal one. If the explanation is personal, then it is theistic. Therefore, the explanation for the existence of God is theistic. So you have either either it's undirected natural forces that cause consciousness, or it's personal. It can't be undirected natural forces. It's got to be personal. And if it's personal, then we're talking about a theistic explanation. That's basically the way the argument from consciousness goes. Now, I've got a couple more minutes. I want to show this video, and it's exactly 10 minutes. Now, this guy is not a Christian. He's a pantheist. But sometimes I find videos that do a really good job explaining it. So I'm just going to throw this one out there. So, just bear in mind that he's not a Christian, okay? But we would agree much the same with what he's saying. It is.
Consciousness, free will, and the brain. Let's discuss the very basics of the mechanics of what happens when we process stimuli and make decisions. In this example, let's talk about something we see. Our eyes see something. Our retina sends the signal of this light pattern down the optic nerves, which meet at the optic chiasm, then move down the optic tracts and optic radiations to the visual cortex in the back of the brain. This is the processing unit for our brains in regards to sight. This processed information is sent to the prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking part of the brain, which is responsible for our cognitive behaviors and decision making and things like that. This information is processed until, bam, we make a decision, quote unquote. Having done so, the brain activates whatever it needs to in order to make the body do whatever response it deemed as appropriate. It is this process, in my experience with it, that is one of the most influential elements of our world that leads me to believe that our current paradigm of the world is not 100% correct. And here is why. In the view of an atheist determinist, my behavior would be the outcome of complex processing units, and that's it. My brain has a complex network of neurons, axons, neurochemicals, and synapses that process stimuli in a manner that is purely causal. What I mean by that is this. The molecules and structure of my brain simply act in accordance to physics and spit out results. Through billions of years of evolution, these molecules have arranged themselves in such a pattern that the result aids in keeping the structure of my body alive long enough to replicate my genetic code. Since the brain is incredibly complex, with billions of neurons and trillions of synapses, the result is not easy to predict for an outside observer, but the complexity of the system would have no influence over the physical nature of our world and its causal relationship. So a materialist determinist would hold that what's going on in the frontal lobes is more complex than the processing that's happened in the visual cortex, but the mechanics is exactly the same. In the same way that your visual cortex processes the stimuli from your retina, your frontal lobes process this and decide what to do with exactly the same mechanical process. Clearly, such a view leaves no room for free will, since the circuitry in the brain, from the optic nerves to the visual cortex to the frontal lobes, process the information based solely on its structure and programming. There is nothing making a choice here. It is a cascade of neural activity that ends in behavior. It's a long and complex cascade, but it's driven solely by chemistry and physics. The problem in this is that with such a view, there is no reason or purpose for consciousness, because whether the brain happened to be self-aware or not, this would have absolutely no effect on the outcome of chemical and physical processes. Consciousness doesn't change the laws of physics or chemistry. These activities would happen whether or not you are a thinking, conscious entity. Therefore, in this particular worldview, the consciousness is superfluous. The best you could do is say that consciousness is a useless byproduct of this activity. Useless because it has absolutely no effect on chemical and physical activity, the only determinants in brain activity and behavior. Here's a clip of a renowned scientist named Steven Pinker discussing this view of the world, which he holds and shares, and why he thinks free will does not fit into it.
I don't believe there's such a thing as free will in the sense of a ghost in the machine, a spirit or soul that somehow reads the TV screen of the senses and pushes buttons and pulls levers of behavior. There's no sense that we can make of that. I think our behavior is the product of physical processes in the brain. On the other hand, when you have a brain that consists of 100 billion neurons connected by 100 trillion synapses, there is a vast amount of complexity that means that human choices will not be predictable in any simple way from the stimuli that have impinged on it beforehand. We also know that that brain is set up so that there are at least two kinds of behavior. There's what happens when I shine a light in your eye and your iris contracts, or I hit your knee with a hammer and your leg jerks upward. We also know that there's a part of the brain that does things like choose what to have for dinner, whether to order chocolate or vanilla ice cream, how to move the next chess piece, whether to pick up the paper or put it down. That is very different from your iris closing when I shine a light in your eye. That second kind of behavior, one that engages vast amounts of the brain, particularly the frontal lobes, that incorporates an enormous amount of information in the causation of the behavior, that has some mental model of the world that can predict the consequences of possible behavior and select them on the basis of those consequences. All of those things carve out the realm of behavior that we call free will, which it is useful to distinguish from brute involuntary reflexes, but which doesn't necessarily have to involve some mysterious soul.
So Pinker, who is clearly a determinist materialist that shares the views I have described thus far, points out the difference between involuntary brute reflexes and higher cognitive function. The difference, he says, between the two is a vast amount of complexity, which still doesn't even begin to address the missing element, a conscious thinking mind. He briefly touched on the conscious mind, but his explanation fell short. He said our complex brains form a mental model of the world and selects among possibilities. But remember, he does not believe in free will, so his wording is misleading. Nothing is making a choice to select anything. His explanation best describes what is happening when your computer plays chess. The computer has a mental model of the layout of the chessboard. It remembers and learns from your moves. It cross-references millions of different outcomes before making its move. But it doesn't think about its move. It isn't experiencing the chess game. It is simply a very complex system reacting to the environment with complex behavior. This type of processing and behavior is one element of our mind, but it is clearly not the entire picture. The computer behaves appropriately in order to play chess, and it does so with extreme skill. But we do more than behave like chess players. We are thinking about the game. We are experiencing the game. We are aware that we are playing the game. The materialist determinist model of the world is a great way to describe how a central processing unit can evolve to display complex, appropriate behaviors. But the crucial element of the conscious mind is left in the dust with no meaning or purpose. Here's a clip of a renowned physician, Dr. Ramachandran, explaining how the conscious experiencing self-aware mind is ignored in the understanding of the physical processes of the brain. Not just that, but how such an understanding leaves no reason to even postulate that a conscious mind is present, mainly because the brain wouldn't need one to operate in this manner.
So I poke you with a needle. It's not just that you say, ow, okay? There is also an internal subjective experience of being conscious of pain. If I poke somebody else with a needle, I can describe all the pathways, everything that's active, the cascade of chemicals, neural activity coming to the Broca's area, and you say, ow, right? But I don't experience anything. And there's no reason for you to postulate that that person is internally experiencing a mental phenomenon called qualia. When I poke myself with a needle, if I look at myself with an autocerebroscope 500 years from now, and I plot the diagram and I say all of these things are going on, but my God, it leaves something out, namely the internal subjective experience.
Dr. Ramachandran is well known for his work in neuroscience and often refers to the self-aware consciousness as the holy grail of neuroscience. From what I've seen and read from him, I have little doubt that he is a materialist determinist and is expecting to find something in the physical aspects of the brain that solves the problem of consciousness. I like this guy because, although he likely wouldn't share my view and seems to favor the materialist determinist worldview, he isn't making it easy on himself. He's not saying consciousness pops into existence simply because the brain is complex. He understands that even a non-conscious, non-thinking entity, such as a computer, can form mental models, learn, examine millions of possibilities of the future based on its actions, and then react. Consciousness is something other than this. It's something very special that our current paradigm of how the brain works fails to explain, or even takes into account. If we have no free will, then a thinking conscious mind is superfluous. A materialist determinist has to deal with the problem of consciousness by seeing it as a permutation of the physical processes, but has no influence over them. This makes its purpose less than dubious. If you think consciousness aids in survival, then you are saying the conscious mind does have influence on neurophysiology. But since consciousness is an abstract entity, holding this view means you are not a materialist. Without free will, consciousness becomes meaningless. Since I know that my self-aware conscious mind is, by far, the most important aspect of who and what I am, free will must then be an inevitability. Calling your rational thinking mind purposeless is the deepest form of self-betrayal.
All right. Do I have...
The average person believes in a soul. Like, I haven't heard before of someone who said, okay, no such thing as free will.
So then...
I found it really creepy to me when you were talking about that. How does he have a relationship with someone? He'll always just be like, oh, my brain's doing...
Which one?
The first one with the pearl?
Yeah, Steven Pinker?
That's so weird. I've never
But you got to understand, this is actually the logical... I mean, the people who... Most people who in academia who are biologists and understand that the way the brain works, all it is it's a series of synapses where, an electrical impulses goes to another, thread of electrical impulses, and there's this interconnected web, and bam, 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 and then bam, you get your sensory input that goes to the prefrontal cortex, it goes around and, and then it goes to the motor cortex, and then you respond, right?
That's like less than 1%
It is, this is, well, within the realm of academia, materialism is the big gorilla on the block when it comes to the academic realm. And just something so simple as it's impossible to describe mental events in physical terms just explodes that worldview. It explodes the whole worldview. And so, yes, people hold to ideas that are not consistent with their worldview. And our job is to expose that and make them epistemologically self-conscious of their own inconsistencies. So, this would be a useful thing to do. Can we wait? Can you guys wait 4 minutes for one more? If you want to leave, you can, but I want you to see this, okay? This is J.P. Morgan. Most of my material came from this guy.
Traditional
material, not him, but the other guy.
Mortality of the soul, even among Christian philosophers. What do you make of that?
I think a lot of it's sociological. I think we live in a day where scientism is the default position by a lot of people. That's the idea that science and science alone can give us answers to our questions about reality. And I think it's a big mistake to advance that view.
So you believe that there is an immortal soul?
Yes, and I don't think the issue is scientific. The fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and whether there is a soul are just not scientific questions. They're questions like, what exactly is a thought? What is a semantic meaning? And in fact, there hasn't been a single discovery in neuroscience or any other branch of science that a dualist, that is one who believes in the soul and consciousness, could not easily accommodate within his theory.
Now, what is the difference between a so-called property dualist and a substance dualist, which I suspect you are?
A property dualist says that consciousness is different than the properties of the brain, but the brain is what has consciousness. A substance dualist agrees that consciousness isn't physical, and the container of consciousness is not the brain, it's the self or the ego or the soul. Now you might ask, well, how do we know consciousness is different from a brain state? Now here's basically how we know it. There are things true of conscious states that aren't true of physical states, so they can't be the same thing. Thoughts are either true or false, but no brain state is either true or false. Again, a thought can't be located closer to my left ear or my right ear, but the brain state that's going on while I'm having a thought is located in a region of the brain. It has a shape and a size, but the thought itself doesn't. Thoughts have intentionality. They're of things, but no material state of the brain is of anything. One more example. There is a what it is like to be conscious. There is a what it's like to feel pain, what it's like to see red. What it is like is not something that can be captured in the language of physics, chemistry, or neuroscience. What that shows is that consciousness is not physical, but it doesn't say anything about what contains consciousness.
Okay.
Now, a substance dualist is going to define the soul as an immaterial substance that contains consciousness and animates and makes the body living. And a substance dualist is going to go on and say that not only is consciousness different than the states of the brain, but that conscious mental states are contained in the I, or the self, or the ego, whereas the brain states that are going on are contained in the brain. So if I'm stuck by a pin, there will be C fibers firing in my brain, but there will be a feeling of pain in the self, and they're in causal interaction with one another. If I choose to raise my arm, I can cause states to occur in my brain. If you stick me with a pin, the brain state will cause a feeling of pain in the self.
What do you do then with the neural correlates of consciousness, which many brain scientists are now working on and are revealing more and more of?
Well, suppose that I were in an automobile and I was trapped in the driver's seat with a seatbelt and I couldn't get out. My ability to drive around town would depend on whether the car was working. If the car broke down, I wouldn't be able to move. That wouldn't prove I was the car. That would simply prove that I am functionally dependent upon the car when I'm in the car. So I think that neuroscientific correlations are exactly what the dualists would expect. I mean, after all, dualists don't think that when you're praying or when you're thinking about something, your brain pops out of existence. There are things going on in your brain while things are going on in your mind. And there are very important and detailed correlations between the two. But correlation and identity does not make.
Correlation is not identity.
Consciousness just isn't the same thing as physical states of the brain, because there are things true of one that aren't the other. And the self is not identical to the brain, because the self is a simple substance that isn't composed of parts. And these questions are not fundamentally scientific questions, they're philosophical.
All right. With that, let's go home and go to bed.